Thank you. Maybe everyone should stand up for like 15 seconds so that you don't fall asleep. And while you do that, I'll introduce myself. I have a background in the Swedish Foreign Ministry for many years. I spent 5 years dealing with communications and external relations in the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, in Rome. Now I'm the executive director of the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, which is a foundation working in several fields on global governance and related topics. We're based in Uppsala. We work on the post-2015 agenda, as we call it. And I'm really happy to be here and to have been invited to say a few words about that. And I'll try to be short, even if I'm not... I have not been forced in the same way as Katarina, Anders, and others, but I'll try to be brief to give some space for questions. And the question is, would networks help in influencing and shaping the post-2015 agenda? And the answer, I think, is yes. The post-2015 agenda is what the 193 member states of the United Nations will hopefully decide upon in September 2015. And the idea is that they will decide on new goals that will succeed the Millennium Development Goals that were decided in 2001 and that expire in 2015. And as you know, some of them have been fulfilled. Some of them are not very ambitious. Some of them are very far from being fulfilled, like the indicator below the goals on hunger, since we still have 800 something undernourished or hungry people in the world. So why and how can networks play a role? I'm sort of two minds here, because yes, a network involving different stakeholders in a field, they can certainly make a case, and they will be very credible if they make a case. And they will have access to decision makers, multilaterally and nationally and in their different circles. But our field here, food security and agriculture, is broad. I mean, listening to the excellent presentations here, you realize that if we are to influence this agenda, we will have to influence almost everything. Not only a goal saying, yes, we will end hunger by 2030, because we know, maybe not everyone else knows, that food and agriculture is actually about everything. So that makes it very complex. The other dilemma, I think, is that there are very many valid goals to be addressed in a global set of goals. Of course, we all know that you need food to be able to survive, but you need to be healthy as well. You need shelter, and you need some basic things that are all very valid. So, and I'll come back to that, the competition between the different fields. So the Millennium Development Goals were 8. I will not repeat them, but one was related to poverty. That was goal number 1, and that included a target on hunger. There was an earlier set of goals, and a hunger goal set by the World Food Summit in 1996 that preceded the goals, and they are different. And I think this is really funny, because the FAO-driven goal was about the number of people being hungry, halving the number, while the Millennium Development Goals contain a less ambitious goal, the proportion of halving the proportion of people that are hungry. And many of you here are familiar with statistics, so you would understand that this is quite different. But the world leaders were not ready to take on a more ambitious goal, I think. And this shows that we are really into politics. At the same time, the reason for this low attention to hunger and agriculture in the Millennium Development Goals I think was also a reflection of the neglect of agriculture that we saw, not least in the richer part of the world. So there was a gap and a tension between the Rome-based food agriculture organizations and New York, and in all countries that were involved that had very different views. And I think that is funny because that tension is still there, and I'll come back to that because I read through some FAO documents preparing for this, and it's exactly the same tension, even if food and agriculture have come back on the agenda. So this is a very long process that in the end will be decided about by member states, but it's very different from the Millennium Development Goals process, because now the United Nations and many, many member states, they do their best to involve civil society, private sector, academia, and so on. So we have created a situation where everyone wants to influence the agenda. And it could be that this leads to a lot of discontent in the end if you feel that you have not been able to influence it. You can say that it started in Rio +20, where the Sustainable Development Goals agenda was decided. No goals, but a way forward. Presently in New York, there is an open working group dealing with the Sustainable Development Goals. They are supposed to report to the General Assembly, the main decision body of the United Nations, in September this year. In parallel, there has been a group composed of private sector and academia led by Jeff Sachs, where Stockholm Environment Institute and the Resilience Center and others have been involved. They have come up with a report. There has been a high-level panel of eminent persons where the former development minister, Gunilla Carlsson, was a member. They have delivered a report, and that panel was, of course, carefully composed of men and women, private sector, government, poor countries, rich countries, and so on. I will come back to their views. In parallel, there have also been 100 country-level consultations conducted by UNDP, and about 8 thematic consultations, out of which one on food security, conducted by Spain, FAO, IFAD, WFP, and another country that I cannot remember off the cuff. So there are a lot of inputs into this very, very complex negotiation. So there is an additional important report, I think, and that is the report of the Secretary General that is based on the other reports, except for the Open Working Group on the Sustainable Development Goals, because they have not finished yet. The Secretary General says in this report that is called A Life of Dignity for All, that we should end hunger. And I think this is the first time that you have a Secretary General say that the goal should be to end hunger, not to halve or change, but actually to have a very ambitious goal, which is very encouraging. He's also addressing almost all the other topics that you brought forward here today, which again underlines how complex this is, and that it is not only about the goals or the indicators, but it's also about the ambition and the implementation, or the means of implementation, and I'll come back to that as well. Maybe I should mention also about the high-level panel report that is the report that has been most given most exposure, that they also talk about ending hunger. They underline access, affordable, safe, and nutritious food, reduce stunting, but not end stunting, increase agricultural productivity with a focus on sustainability, increase smallholder yields, access to irrigation, adopt sustainable agricultural, ocean, freshwater fishery practices, and rebuild designated fish stocks to sustainable levels, reduce post-harvest loss and food waste by X%. And now I'm only looking at their goal number 5. They have 13 goals, and many of them are of relevance, of course, for the topics we're discussing here today. I should also say what I think is important is that when the roles of different actors is discussed, not least this high-level panel of which Gunilla Carlsson was a member, talk about partnerships and the role of the private sector. So it's giving much more prominence. And this is fascinating because it has also led to a discussion between private sector and civil society about holding not only governments accountable, but also private sector accountable when it comes to the environment, human rights, workers' rights, and so on. So in a way, much more than 15 years ago, all topics are on the agenda, and I don't envy those that have to try to sort this out, especially since we know that when 193 governments come together, they will want to have their pets, and maybe additional pets even, represented in the agenda. So the question is, of course, will this document in the end be able to steer anything? Coming back to this proposal from, I think, all the actors so far, ending hunger, I think that will actually be decided. I don't think that will be a problem. I think humanity, in a way, has come so far with interconnectivity and knowledge and so on that everyone realizes that from a human rights perspective, we cannot have any other goal. But I think there is a risk that the whole thing will stumble on resources and funding and means of implementation. And I can very well see some bigger middle-income developing countries say that we will not agree to anything unless the rich part of the world is willing to give more resources, change trade policies, change agricultural subsidies, to again talk about our area of work. So the main concern may not be in phrasing the goals or having ambitious goals, but actually getting it through by finding a balance when it comes to means of implementation and resources. This problem, I think, has also led to a very interesting discussion about domestic resources. How can countries raise more resources themselves? How can they stop tax evasion, build tax systems, create an enabling environment for the private sector, not only be dependent on external action like trade, financial markets, and so on. So even if, in my view, I think trade issues and financial market issues are really key to finding solutions to world problems, there is also a lot that can be done if governance works in the individual countries. The funding issue and the competition that will start sooner or later in this negotiation process, I think, is also dependent on a very bad world climate, where, and I'm not talking about climate change, I'm talking about the political climate, where there's very little trust among countries. We see changes in powers, when maybe Europe going down, maybe the US going down, maybe China coming up, and an unwillingness among many powers to adjust to needs like what we've heard today, planetary boundaries, social issues, inequalities, and so on, because they want to cling to the power that they have, or they don't want to engage in common solutions because they think they're stronger on their own. And the world political climate today is really, compared to the year 2000 when the Millennium Development Goals were decided, much worse. I'm sorry to say, but that makes me pessimistic in a way. I already mentioned that I think that everyone will go for their goals and we will have this very, very complex agenda as an issue. There is another change here that I think is very positive, and that is that they talk about universal goals. This means that we are not only targeting poor countries or developing countries, but actually we target goals and change for everyone. Universal goals with national implementation. And also here we have several topics that we have talked about, like food waste, which is I guess is a big problem for us. Consumer patterns is another one. Trade issues and so on. So goals for the rich, I think, is a good description of part of this agenda that I don't think that many of us are aware of, because this process is not being discussed in developed countries. It's far more discussed through the national consultations in poorer countries or developing countries. So this may come as a shock for many governments and for many people engaged and not engaged, that there will be goals that we have to live up to as well. Or since we will be a strong negotiator, we may dilute the goals that would influence the situation for the rich. You never know. I've tried to describe what I see as a very complex agenda, but what I also see as a very important discussion. And I think it's sad that still this is more or less only discussed among people that are involved in development in one way or the other, because if universal goals, changing patterns in different fields, are to come true, we need to involve much more people. And if voices from the South, both from governments and from civil society, that want to address financial markets, trade, and so on, it involves the whole society building that we have today. Now, I don't think that will be the case, but of course, since many of us here are concerned with natural resources, climate, and the environment, we should try to use this to be able to move forward. Now, what can a network like SIANI do from now on? If we look at the Swedish level, the timetable now is that negotiations with all countries involved will start in September. Before that, there are consultations taking place in this open working group on the Sustainable Development Goals that will then merge with the others in September. And also some thematic consultations are being held in the General Assembly. Among them, one on biodiversity, oceans, and water, which I find extremely interesting. I have not seen any new consultation on food. I think that is maybe because my guess that ending hunger is more or less already agreed. They don't think they need to talk about it again. The Swedish government, as far as I understand, have an agreed position. I don't know if that position is public, but that can, of course, be asked for. And if SIANI could very well contact the I don't know if anyone is still here from, yes, Landsbygdsdepartementet, to discuss what can be done in all the fields that are relevant for food and agriculture. The other aspect of influencing the Swedish agenda is, of course, to organize seminars and write papers. And read the two main reports, or three main reports, I think is a very good idea to see where they stand. The Secretary General's report, the high-level panel report, and the report of the Jeffrey Sachs group. The Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation and UNDP here in Stockholm, we organize regularly every month seminars on the post-2015 topic. We had one on food security and Food and the Planet sort of event in April last year. We will have, the next one will be on the 3rd of February, and it is about the private sector. And there you can, of course, address many issues that also concern our agenda here. Globally, and now I'm coming back to the sense of of being second class that they have in Rome in the food-based agencies of the United Nations. We can, or you can work through the structures of the Committee on Food Security and others there, where there is an academic entry point, civil society, and so on. And they feel that they need to mobilize to be able to influence the New York diplomats' negotiations so that the issues that they work with should not be forgotten. My foundation works a lot with civil society in the South, and they have a very strong agenda on food and agriculture. And if they're listened to, I think they will really drive some of the issues that we have discussed here today. And we are making the foundation available also for more closed seminars on difficult topics. So if we identify a need to bring people with different views together in Uppsala, we are certainly willing to do so. But no matter if you work on food and agriculture or if not, I think this agenda is really worth to study and to follow and to try to influence. Thank you.
So I think one of our last program. Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. Well, does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask, Annika? Okay.
I had one question.
Okay.
I'm Torsten Selander from the Swedish Forest Agency. I realize I have some catching up to do after your presentation here, so maybe this is a stupid question, but anyway, in what way will climate change issues be integrated into this process?
It's not at all a stupid question, because I think this is it's a sticking point, really. Some think that climate change will have to be decided upon before that the follow-on of the Kyoto Protocol will have to be decided before this agenda is decided, because this group, this context will not be able to solve the climate issue. And I saw that actually yesterday, the Secretary, or was it Friday, the Secretary General took an initiative to urge countries again to come to New York in September to have a special session on climate. And that testifies, in my view, to the fact that he thinks that this has to be dealt with separately. But you can see in all the reports that I mentioned that they talk about climate change and setting new targets and so on. So it is not at all excluded that it will come up there as well. But I think they prefer to have a separate track and then bring it into to this broader context, if it can be solved at all.
Okay. Annika.
Thanks for a very nice presentation. My name is Håkan Jönsson from SLU, and you talked about universal goals, which was very interesting and new to me. In the climate change business, there's sort of a view that each human being has sort of the right to a certain emission of carbon dioxide equivalents. Is there some talk somewhat similar in this food business, that each person might have the right to a certain amount of animal protein or something like that, that we should share that more equally, just like we want to share the carbon dioxide equivalents more equally?
I cannot swear, because I don't know every detail of all these reports, but I have not seen anything like that in the Secretary General's report, which is a very brief report. It's only 8 pages or something like that. But I've not seen that anywhere. No.
Okay, thank you.
Very good. So I think, thank you for answering questions and keeping time. That's my job.